Okay, we're talking about contingencies and disclosures. So first of all, what is a contingency?
A condition.
A condition, right? It's a condition. We're saying, so I will buy the property, in this case, as it relates to the state of California and buyers and sellers, and the buyer making an offer with a contingency, the buyer is saying, I will make the offer, I will buy your home under the condition, and we won't use the word condition moving forward. We're going to use the proper word in its place, contingency. Contingent upon something happening. So I'm going to buy your house. I promise to buy your house contingent upon me getting my loan. I promise to buy your home contingent upon the home appraising at value that we agree to. I promise to buy your home contingent on a home inspection that I have a chance to review and am comfortable with. I promise to buy your house contingent upon any other investigations that I might want to conduct. And as long as everything is to my liking and I don't find something that surprises me or maybe that I'm uncomfortable with, I'm going to go ahead and promise to buy your home. That's what a contingency is. So when you are removing that contingency up front, when you make the offer, if you're saying, I promise to buy your house and it's not contingent on the appraisal, what are you saying? No matter what the appraisal is, I'm still buying the house.
Right.
So if the list price, to put an example around this, if the list price is $524,900 and you make an offer of $524,900 and you do not make that offer contingent upon the appraisal, and the appraisal comes in at $510,000, your buyer is buying the home.
Mm-hmm.
And the buyer is contractually obligated to buy the home for how much? $510,000 or $524,900?
$524,900.
For the amount he offered.
$524,900, correct. Right. So where's that at, you might ask? You got to write it in the contract, right? So let's look it up here. Let me find one that would have the correct documents. So I'm going to look up this is on the listing side, or is this on both? Forgive me, I pulled up a listing rather than I'm on both sides of it, but no, I'm not. What am I thinking? That is only, I should.
And that's the verbiage, contingent upon appraisal.
Well, I'm going to show you what it is because, here we go, here's a test one. So I'm going to show you as soon as I bring up the contract. La-di-da, la-di-dee. Okay, here we go. Where is it at? So here's the thing. The California Association of Realtors Attorneys have gotten together and drafted a contract for your behalf, an offer. We went over this a couple of weeks ago, the residential purchase agreement, right? So they have drafted this document for you to utilize when you're making an offer. So they have built in some contingencies on your behalf. And as you can see on page 2, and it would be under item 3, as it says right here, item 3, right? Item 3 on the second page, item 3, J3 is the loan contingency. If the buyer does not receive loan approval within 21 days, that's your loan contingency. Now, it gets more in depth, and we'll go there in a moment. But that's the loan contingency. If the buyer must receive loan approval and remove the loan contingency within 21 days, that's what this is stating. Okay? We're going to go deeper later. Okay? But that's on the surface, that's what that's saying. Above it it talks about in 3I, the appraisal contingency and removal. And what does it say? It says this agreement is contingent upon a written appraisal of the property by a licensed or certified appraiser at no less than the purchase price. It is already written in the document for you. You do not have to take any action. Now, when would you take action? Well, when you take action is if the buyer says, I'm going to buy it no matter what, I don't need the contingency. Then you would check this box, and that removes that contingency or that condition. Now, the way our agreement reads is this agreement is not contingent upon a written appraisal of the property. Now, does that mean that the buyer is not going to get an appraisal? Correct. It does not make that assertion. What it is saying is, it doesn't really matter what the results of that appraisal report are. We're going to move forward. We're not going to hold anything up as a result of that. Right? We're moving forward. Wouldn't it be the same thing for a loan contingency? If within 21 days, buyer shall, as specified in paragraph 14 in writing, to remove the loan contingency or cancel this agreement. If there is an appraisal contingency, removal of the loan contingency shall not be deemed removal of the appraisal contingency. They are two separate things. A lot of folks get those two wrapped around together, and they're not one and the same. You can come back with a perfect appraisal, and you didn't pay Capital One on time last month, and now you can't get your loan. Two different things. Okay? You can have loan approval and the appraisal not come in at value. Doesn't matter how many times you paid Capital One on time. Right? To use the same scenario. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Now, as we cruise down, you'll see another section, sale of buyer's property. Okay? So if your buyer needed to sell their own property in order to move forward to buy this one, then you would check this box. And now we would have a contingency around the sale of the buyer's property. Make sense? Yes? Do I
Yeah.
still have you?
Yes.
Yes. So in the event that the buyer was not able to secure a buyer for their home, this is where this can get a little confusing if you don't compartmentalize things well, right? If your buyer cannot procure a buyer for their home, then they don't have to buy this home. That's what it's saying. It's a contingency. I have to sell my house before I buy yours. If I cannot find a buyer for my home, then I don't have to buy yours. When the seller agrees to that, the seller is saying, I'm good with it. Put your house on the market, and I'll wait for you to sell yours so you can buy mine. Now, that being said, what if the buyer does not successfully sell their home, but they still want to buy the seller's home?
Remove the contingency.
Remove the contingency if they can. Right? So the buyer would then say, Mr. Seller, we've had a change of heart, and we no longer want to hold up the transaction. We want to go ahead and buy your home, not contingent on the sale of ours. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So they would do an amendment to the contract and change that contingency so it was no longer there. Or a much simpler way of doing it is providing a CR1 or contingency number one. Contingency removal number one. And what we're saying is we now remove that contingency. But you didn't sell the house yet. I know. I remove the contingency. It's no longer a condition of the sale. Are you seeing? These things really need to be compartmentalized. They are different items. It's something that's different than saying, just like when we said that we are going to remove the appraisal contingency did not necessarily mean we're not going to get an appraisal. Those are two different things. Right? And putting my house up for sale and wanting to sell it before I buy yours doesn't necessarily mean that I have to do that. Lots of people own two houses, especially for a short period of time. A lot of people can buy one while they're selling the other one, and they don't have to. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you might do some due diligence, and you might make sure that the lender, right, if you represent the seller, or if you represent the buyer, you might want to do some due diligence and ensure that the lender will still loan money to the buyer without selling the home
Sell the house.
before you accept that. Yes?
Yeah.
Right? Because not everyone will qualify for 2 mortgage payments. Some will, some won't. That's going to depend on a variety of different things.
Right.
A variety of different things.
FHA loan would be one.
So Isabel brings up a good point. FHA loan to FHA loan, true. But if they can go conventional, then they can do it. Right? So that's going to be based on the particular circumstance of that individual. But the contingency is a standalone. Please do not mix it up. It's a standalone. It's saying contingent upon. So that means that if I do find a buyer, okay, let me put it a more likely scenario. I make an offer on your home contingent on me selling mine. I find a buyer for my house. And then we move into escrow. And then you as the seller tell me, okay, Drew, come on, put up or shut up. I'm ready for you to tell me you're actually going to buy my house now. I've waited long enough, right? I'm going a little, by the way, there's language that allows this to happen. So don't be confused by that, but that's for another subject, another time. And let's say that we're at that point where the seller has that ability to come to you and say, okay, Drew, put up or shut up. Are you going to buy the house or not? At that point, I'm in escrow with my home. I could now go to my buyer and I could say, buyer, remove all of your contingencies. What's a contingency? A condition. A condition of sale. I promise to buy your home under this condition. So I have the same thing on this end. I'm selling my home to this buyer A over here, and buyer A says, I promise to buy the home, but conditioned upon or contingent upon an appraisal, a loan, a home inspection, these things. Disclosures, right? All of that. So I go to that buyer, and that buyer says, I'm not ready to remove them. Now, I could still remove the contingency with my seller. Now, would I be protected?
No.
No. So again, 2 different things, right? If I remove the contingency, then I am no longer protected. I'm saying I'll do it. Now my buyer says, I looked up Megan's Law. I saw there's a sex offender living 2 blocks away. I'm no longer comfortable. Right? There's nothing I can do. They send me a cancellation. I'm still buying your house. I can't now say, but my buyer's in the website and the thing and the guy moved and it hasn't been updated. I can't have a story. It doesn't matter. It's done.
Yeah.
Okay? You got me. You with me?
Got it. Yes.
Okay.
Got to make sure we keep it.
So here's the thing, but Clara said you got to make sure you keep it. Well, okay, but you got to make sure, I think more importantly, you have to make sure that you're properly communicating with your clients how this works.
Because in reality, they could still back out, right?
So that's a really good point that Isabel's bringing up. She says in reality they can still back out, right?
I mean, they're gonna lose their deposit. But
Right.
they're still
What are we really
lose the
talking
deposit.
about? Yeah, what are we really talking about here?
losing your deposit.
right? Because you're not going to ever force a buyer to buy, and you're never going to force a seller to sell. That's not going to be a thing. But what you are talking about is the deposit. That's the reason why the buyer puts the deposit up,
Right,
is to protect the seller against them misbehaving during the middle of the agreement
hold the buyer.
and taking advantage of them.
So the.
That's what it's for. So I remove all of my contingencies, and then I come back and I say, I don't want to. I'm just not feeling it. I don't want to do it anymore. Right? Okay. And you lose your deposit.
So really, the contingency are set in place to protect the.
The contingencies are set in place to protect the buyer's deposit. Right?
Right.
Now, that being said, I think it's also really important to know and understand that it goes a little bit deeper than that, that depending on depending on the situation, you could find yourself in a lawsuit.
Right.
It doesn't have to just be the deposit. If the buyer is found negligent in something, right, then the seller could claim that, depending on the liquidated damages and other things that are found within the agreement, right? But I just want you to know it doesn't just stop there. The exposure to the buyer, to the client, doesn't just stop with the deposit necessarily. I want to make that distinction clear. It's not just about, now, most of the time, that is pretty much what we are talking about. The extent of the damage to the seller is typically whatever the deposit is, because that was negotiated up front. It was what they call a calculated risk. Yeah? We make a calculated risk going into a transaction. The seller says, I'm willing to accept a $5,000 deposit. And the calculated risk is, if the worst thing happens, which is just days before escrow is scheduled to close, the buyer cannot perform, and I'm left holding the bag, is $5,000 enough to make me whole for what I just went through?
Probably not.
And
depending
the
on-
reality is, if we remove the emotion and we look at it from a logical stance, especially in today's market, it in fact is enough. Because while we were in escrow, we just gained $10,000 in value, and now we got the buyer's $5,000, and now we're going to go to market, and we're going to sell within 48 hours with 10 more offers for 10 more than what it just went up. We're going to end up netting 20 more than we did with the first escrow. Right? So likely we're good, right? Now, in another market condition, is $5,000 enough? Again, depending on the severity of the situation. In most cases, we find out within the first 30 days the buyer cannot perform. And in those types of situations, typically that deposit is enough if we remove the emotion. Now, anytime we don't remove the emotion, it's never enough. There was a $4 billion deposit. It wasn't enough because of what I went. I mean, this is truly how we react when we're going through the stress, because the emotion of the stress that we just went through is more than any dollar amount, right? Would you agree you cannot put a dollar amount to stress?
Yes.
The top three things that are the most stressful situations, it's death and divorce and buying or selling a piece of real estate, right? And I would argue that public speaking is
Close second, close third.
right. Public speaking and then death. For most people, I would rather die than get up in front of a group of people. So it's death, right? It's public speaking, then death, and then divorce, and then tied with divorce is buying or selling a home, probably. So you get my drift. So that level of stress is very, very high on your seller. Remember, please, you are professional real estate agents, and as a result of that, you do this every day. Your buyers and sellers are not engaged in the business of buying and selling real estate every day, on the whole. Yes? So the stress on them is greater than it is on you. If you're whatever stress you're carrying, they are probably carrying 50 times what you're carrying. So please keep that in mind and remember that your job is to not get on the roller coaster with them. What do I mean? So emotions, if you think about this, emotions really are a roller coaster ride. Think about that for a moment. Now, a lot of us have improved our emotional intelligence, and we actually have the ability to sort of stand outside of the roller coaster and kind of watch the roller coaster happen before our eyes, and then some of us aren't, and we're not good at that, and we get on the roller coaster ride, and we buckle our seatbelt and put the bar down, and we go along for the ride. And some not so much. Well, as a professional, I need you to remove yourself from the roller coaster. You need to be standing outside of Colossus. Imagine you're at Magic Mountain, and Colossus is the big white one. That's not as popular as it was when I was a teenager. Now it's other things, but it's the one that everybody knows, right? Or Goliath. Goliath is one of my favorites. You're going to be standing outside of Goliath, right, Ashley? You're not going to get on Goliath. It's too big. It's too scary.
I would never get on Goliath.
It's Goliath. It's Goliath, for Pete's sake. Right? So we're going to stand outside and we're going to watch the roller coaster. And our job is, in fact, to every once in a while to reach in and grab our client off of Goliath and pull him next to us. Figuratively, please. This is being recorded and it's going to be out on YouTube land. I don't want you thinking I'm actually telling you to go to Magic Mountain and find your client on the ride of Goliath and try to yank them out of the seat while they're on the cart. This is the world we're living in 2021. I think you understand what I'm saying. Figuratively speaking only, you need to be grounded.
The professional is watching the roller coaster, not on the roller coaster.
The professional is watching the roller coaster, not on the roller coaster. You're standing and you're watching, and every once in a while you're going to reach in and bring them back so that they're grounded with you. Okay? A little sidebar, because it's really super important. So the stress level that we take on is never worth the amount of money that the buyer's putting up. Well, again, our job is to stand not in the roller coaster with our client, but to stand outside and reach in and grab them and bring them back to reality. Well, here's the reality of the situation, seller. What are we really actually out? We were scheduled to close the end of May. We've been in escrow for 2 weeks. We're going to get the $5,000, or 3 weeks, whatever. We're going to get the $5,000. We're going to go back to market. By the end of this weekend, we're likely to have 6 more offers, and we're going to go back into escrow at least the same way we came in, or came out, however you want to say it. Are you with me? Right? That's going to calm them down. We're going to pull them off of that roller coaster, and they're not going to be as quiet and much about, but they said this and promised this, and you told me this, and what about? It's not about that. Okay? So what we're talking about is the deposit, and it could get worse, but usually it's not. And that usually can be managed by the professional remaining the professional in the situation. Are you with me? Usually when this stuff gets out of control and we want to start taking people to court is when the agent gets on the roller coaster with the client. I don't want you coming away from this thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know enough to keep my, yes you do. Because it's not about what you know. I'm telling you, people in the world do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. Your emotional intelligence on this is way more important than your IQ on this. Your ability to keep them focused on the goal, your ability to keep them on the correct track is way more important than what you're actually saying about the ins and outs. Are you with me? Okay? When we see things that escalate, it's because we didn't do a good job of that. Or because there's real big, huge negligence, or that could be, right? If somebody truly lied to us and everyone else, then okay. But Usually that's not the case. Usually it is because we jumped on board. I often tell a story about an agent that I had in my office. Her name was Tracy. And Tracy, she's no longer in the business. She's no longer a licensee. But Tracy would oftentimes, and admittedly, we would talk about this, would involve herself on the roller coaster. And so we were finding ourselves in these broker client agent meetings a lot, where we were trying to dissolve issues and diffuse feelings and emotion and figure it out. We couldn't. So one day I happened to be there when it took place in front of my eyeballs, and I could see it unfold when a roof report came back unfavorably. And so what had happened was this agent had a pretty solid knowledge of construction and how things looked and were and should be. So there was an assumption that was made about the roof, which sometimes can happen. And then when the roof report came back from a new roofer that was in town that was unfavorable, the very first thing that she did was first sit down and her jaw hit the floor. $7,400, don't quote me on the price, I don't remember the price. $7,400. What? You're trying to rip me off. And so what now? The next call was not to the roofer. The next call was not to a second roofer. The next call wasn't to me to coach her off the cliff. The next call was to the client. And the conversation looked something, again, this is 18 years ago, so I don't have exactly verbatim, but it went something like this. Oh my gosh, you'll never guess what just happened. This guy walked in with the roof report and it came back and he wants $7,400. He wants to take everything off and replace the whole roof. Oh my gosh, I don't even know what to think right now. Now, the person on the other side of the phone, although I couldn't hear the words, I could hear the tone and I could hear yelling and I could hear through the phone that it was definitely escalating. And now I'm brought in. So what did I do before I even met with the client, right? I pushed it out first so that the client, the mood and everything would be now de-escalated emotionally, right? I don't want to tell her to come in right away in 15 minutes. No. I have time on Thursday.
Next month.
I have time on Thursday at 3. And then what am I doing? My very next call is to 2 other roofers to get opinions. And then by the time she comes in and sits down with us, now I have 3 opinions. I have the original one that made us go off the rails and get on Goliath and put our arms up and scream and yell. And then I have the other 2, which are in those 2 agree with one another and directly contradict the first one. So now that we have 2 reports saying with minor repairs they can provide a certification, we have to disclose all 3 to the buyer. We're going to get there in just a moment about how the state of California is a full disclosure state. We have to disclose all 3 to the buyer, and because we have 2 against 1, the seller does have the ability to say, I can get the roof certed. They could make an argument for that. I didn't just pick the one I liked. Right? That's why you don't get just 2 when you have something like that. That's why I called 2 other roofers and not just 1. Because then I would only have he said. Now what do I do? I picked the one I like. Well, the buyer likes the other one. So now what do I do, right? So I get 2. Sometimes 3 if I really think it's going to be a battle. So that I have 3 against 1. Okay? And then that can bite you. You got to be careful because now you might have 2 and 2. It hasn't happened to me, but they could. Right? And you get a 5th, right? But it hasn't happened. It's usually 2 to 1. Or it's 3 to 1 because the one is trying to get a job out of it, typically. If they're the only one saying it, typically they're trying to get a job out of it. Okay? So that's the other thing when you're talking with your buyer, help them to understand that these are contractors and sometimes, like a piece of their job is marketing and sales. And they might be looking at their May calendar and be thinking, the roof doesn't look so good. Maybe, I don't know. Does it cloud your judgment when you need to feed your kids? It doesn't mean anybody's dishonest, but let's face it, when you're out there trying to feed your family, is your judgment clouded when you're looking at something? When you're swamped up till December with more jobs than you can handle, is your judgment clouded? In the other direction. We're human beings, and that can happen, right? So we say we have one bad report, here's two others, right? And then it diffused it. So the growth opportunity that took place with her that day, and she did grow from that, she did learn from that. She didn't even realize she was doing it. What happened is her heart was so in for her client. She was in love with her. Every client were her best friends, right? That's a really awesome thing to have. So because of that, she was transferring her energy to them, and they were receiving it, okay? That's just really great. We just want to be careful how and what energy we transfer. That's not the energy we want to transfer. Are you with me? Okay. So now what's another contingency?
You said the loan,
We talked about the loan, we talked about the appraisal, inspection,
Contingency?
the
Inspection.
inspection. Now, if we remove the inspection contingency, does that mean that our buyer is not getting an inspection?
No.
No. We can remove the contingency and still go get an inspection. There's
We may not
nothing
get
wrong
the
with that.
repairs.
We're just saying that whatever comes back on that report is not going to hold us up from the purchase of the home.
Right.
We're going to move forward. Now, what if something happens on the home inspection? What if I do that and the home inspection comes back and it's not good? And I don't want to move forward. Right, I'm going to lose my deposit. I'm going to go to the listing agent straight away and say, so we removed that contingency on the home inspection because we really and truly in our heart of hearts believed and trusted that this report was going to come back perfectly clean. And it turns out that it needs a new HVAC system, and I got a bid for that, and it's going to be $10,478.32, and my buyer doesn't have the money. And the home warranty won't cover it because it's on the home inspection report. So unfortunately, my buyer cannot proceed with the purchase of the home. And at that point in time, now the seller could be nice if they wanted. The seller could be nice if they wanted, right? They could offer a couple of different things, right? They could offer to split the cost of the HVAC unit. They could offer to pay for the whole thing and continue on, or they could offer to release them and give them their deposit back. They could offer to release them and give them half of their deposit back. But at that point in time, the seller is in the driver's seat. But it doesn't mean the buyer is locked in and has to do it, right? And depending on your marketplace would depend on what the action of that seller would likely to be. Also, whatever tonality you bring, because they're going to be looking to you, right? And again, I'm not saying that agents are right or wrong for this, because I can clearly see it both ways. I was having a discussion with an agent who is a good friend of mine, and he was talking about in this market, it is what it is, and you got to work for your seller. So what he's saying is take advantage of the situation if you can for your seller, and that's, in his eyes, doing a good job. He's not wrong, ladies and gentle cars. He's not wrong. His fiduciary is to protect his seller. And at the end of the day, if he feels good and his seller feels good about the fact that he walked away with their deposit and it doesn't matter, I, on the other hand, err more on the side of a win-win.
Mm-hmm.
I want to create a situation where none of us knew this HVAC unit was broken. The fact that it is broken is we're going to have to deal with it when we put the house back on the market. We're going to now have to disclose it. Any buyer coming forward is likely going to want the thing fixed. I already have these buyers on the hook. I might be able to get more mileage out of them, right, than putting it back. So, maybe I could create a win-win here. And if the buyers simply do not have the money, okay, then maybe I release them and give them their deposit, putting it back on the market with the idea that the next buyer is going to be more pliable, and maybe I can get some more money out of them to compensate for the HVAC unit. Maybe I can eke another $3,000 and they can finance it and it's not cash out of their, are you with me? Who knows what I can do? But I want to create a win-win. So they're going to be looking, the whole point to all of this is not right or wrong. The whole point of this is the walls are gray, the floor is gray, to remind me that it's all gray, right? All the stuff lies within the gray. It's not right and wrong. It's the gray is where the magic happens. Yes? The world is not right and wrong. It's not is or is not. So
basically, your job is to protect the seller. So are you, the agent advising the seller what to do in that situation, or they let the seller make?
well, the decision is up to the seller, but the seller is going to ask you your thought.
Yeah, so the
And
agent
your
is
tonality that you bring
the
is
leader.
gonna, right, you're the leader, as Isabel says. You're the leader in the relationship. So as the leader in the relationship, they're going to weigh heavily on whatever tonality you bring. So if you bring a tonality of slit throats and slicing and cutting and diving, then they might go there with you. If you come from a more win-win, let's see if we can make this work for everybody, then they might come from that. Not always, but they're more likely to come from that place. And remember, next time you might be on the other side. They're going to be impressed upon by your reaction. Remember that you're the leader, and you could be on the other side of this at some point. You could be representing the buyer next time, and the HVAC unit went out. You know? So it's bigger and deeper than just the one transaction, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's a culture, and how you do business within that culture can really make a difference on how things swing your way. Again, there's no right or wrong to this. It's just you find your way. I'm more of a win-win. Other folks are more like, well, when I'm on that side of it, then, oh, well, for me, I got hosed on that one. But my job is to protect my people at that time. So I kind of come from the sense of, because it's my job to have a fiduciary with all of my clients, how I behave in all situations is a reflection on every single one of my clients. So therefore, I must remain in that win-win, very professional, sticking to my values in every transaction, so that when I'm representing 10 buyers from now and it comes back to me, it's going to come back to me in a favorable way when I don't have control. Are you with me? As long as I didn't do anything to harm my person to begin with, it's not what I'm saying. There's just an argument that can be made for both. An argument can be made for getting the buyer out of the way and keeping their deposit and moving on. And an argument can be made for making a win-win situation for both parties and moving on. Argument can be made for both sides, that it could be a win-win and in all scenarios, and you're still sticking up for your client. Now, is the state of California, well, first of all, let's define this. What is the difference between something that is passive and something that is active? What is the difference between something that is active and something that is passive?
Passive comes in without work. Active is you have to intentionally work for it.
So Jason says active is you intentionally have to work for it, and passive is it comes in on its own without action or work.
Well,
Did I properly say that?
yeah, but passive usually takes action in the beginning and then after it.
Okay. Passive takes work in the beginning, and then afterwards it just happens. Okay. All right. Do we agree with that definition? Are we okay with that definition?
That's
Do we have a
clear.
consensus that everybody's okay with that? Okay, I'm
Yeah.
okay with it. I'm okay, right? Okay. So, is the state of California an active, or a passive state when it comes to contingency removal?
Active.
Oh, I'd say passive, actually.
I have a passive, I have an active that changed to passive. I have an active. My two newbies don't have a guess. Maybe I shouldn't call you newbies.
It's all right.
I wouldn't expect you to have an opinion necessarily. You haven't been here long enough to even know. You're an infant.
Rookie, how about rookie? Does that sound good?
My son, when we were building fires in Lake Tahoe, because at Lake Tahoe you can actually have a wood fire, and he would want to put the stuff in the fire right when I would start it. And I would say, Jacob, it's an infant. It's an infant fire. It's not going yet. You have to let the thing go. And then he would come back and he would say, is it still an infant? And I would say, no, we're more like a toddler. And he goes, well, when can it be a kid like me? When it's a kid like you, I'll let you know, and then you could put stuff in the fire. Right? You're an infant, right? You wouldn't know. All right, so how about in Zoom land?
Active.
Wendell is saying active.
I would say active.
I
Active,
did
Marilyn
too.
says. So, in the words of a great preacher and a great leader, nothing just happens. Do you know who said that? In a great sermon by T.D. Jakes himself. He says, nothing just happens. There's a whole sermon series on that. Look it up, YouTube. Nothing just happens by T.D. Jakes, and it's a fantastic 90 minutes of your life. But I say that because in the state of California, it's the same thing. Nothing just happens. We have to do something. This is how I can remember that the state of California is an active contingency state. Because it's not passive, nothing just happens. We have to take some action. So you notice on the contingencies, let's take the inspection contingency as an example. It says the buyer has 17 and then it's been changed to 10 days after acceptance, unless otherwise agreed to in writing, to complete all the investigations, review all the disclosures. I was talking with an agent a little bit ago, right before I started this class, and she said, wait, there's contingencies around disclosures? Now, she's not in this class, and so I'm going to give some, because she should, and I said, maybe you should be in the class. And she said, maybe I should. So here's where it comes in. Let me give her a hard time. Here's where it comes in. Disclosures are also a part of the contingencies. We didn't talk about that yet. We were talking about the inspection and the loan and the appraisal. But if you remember, if you refer back, right here, seller has, on 14, seller has 7 days after acceptance to deliver to the buyer all reports and disclosures and information for which the seller is responsible. See, the state of California is a full disclosure state. The seller must disclose any and all information that they have about the property to the buyer. It's also an as-is due diligence state, meaning that it is the buyer beware. The buyer must do their due diligence, and they must seek out inspections and investigate their materialistic thing they're buying. Whatever it is they're going to buy, they also must seek out and investigate that which they're buying, so they know that they have an accurate picture of what they're buying. And it is the seller's obligation to disclose everything. So you cannot have one and not the other. They both exist in this state. It doesn't matter that the buyer's getting an inspection. The seller has to tell them that they were involved in a lawsuit 4 years ago with the tenant. That came up this week. Do we have to disclose it? Yes. Okay, so we disclosed. Now the buyer wants a copy of the verdict to make sure that the case is closed. But my seller doesn't want to give it to him.
Cancel the purchase.
Why wouldn't you want to give it to him? It's done. It's over. There's no impact on you whatsoever. It's done. It's over. By the way, I don't even know what the verdict is. It doesn't matter. It's over. All they want to make sure, the buyer just wants to make sure that it's completed, that it's finished. They're not going to have to deal with it. You disclosed it. Had they not disclosed it, they would have been held liable if they ever got back, right? If the tenant, if one of the other tenants in the building ever mentioned, oh yeah, when Lucille sued the old owners, that came up. Uh-oh, now what? Now we have liability on our hands. Now, if the seller fully discloses it to the buyer, and the buyer says, okay, I see it, I hear you, I have the information, I'm good with it, and I'm still buying the property, then the buyer cannot come back on the seller.
How would you approach the seller to get that kind of information?
I would explain it just like that. You can either give me the information today, or we can wait about 2 to 3 years, and then when the judge asks you for it, you can give it to him then, along when you're writing your check. You want to do it then or now? Because now there won't be a check, but there could possibly be a check later. You want to get sued twice or once? You've already got sued, you have the verdict. Let's do the right thing. Let's show them the information so that they can feel comfortable with the purchase and move on. They're not doing it to be nosy. They're not doing it to hold it against them. They're doing it because they want to make sure that they're safe.
Right?
What was the lawsuit? What was it for? And who won? What was the result? Is this going to impact me? Did he promise that he would repave the sidewalk every spring? And now next spring I'm going to have to repave the sidewalk and I didn't know anything about it? Like, I got to know what I got to know, right? You got to know it. Full disclosures. Full disclosure state, buyer beware state, both are in existence. We are an active state, meaning that something has to happen. These time frames are not an egg timer, right? Buyer after 17 days.
The reason why I changed my hempstead is because I know California is, however, a lot of agents don't. They don't ask for it.
So what Isabel says, a lot of agents don't. So here's the thing. Sheep do many things. I'll leave it at that.
So like
The sheep do many, many things. Does that make it right? No. What's right is was right, right? What is correct? And what is correct is the buyer has 17 days after the acceptance, unless otherwise agreed to in writing, to complete all of their investigations, review all the disclosures, all the reports, the lease documents to be assumed by the buyer, all of that wonderful stuff, all that information, and then to remove their contingency.
So it's not necessarily the seller's obligation to ask for the removal.
It is the listing agent's obligation to request the removal of contingency. Because if you, who's going to lose out?
The seller.
The seller. The seller, right? As long as the buyer is holding on to conditions, or we're calling them by their proper name now, contingencies. As long as the buyer is holding on to those contingencies, they can cancel. If we're on day 32 of a 45-day escrow and we have not removed item 14B, the inspection contingency, the buyer absolutely is well within his or her right to cancel the agreement and get a full refund of their deposit. Their contingency was still in full effect.
So being the buyer's agent, would you have?
The buyer's agent, you don't want to remove the contingency. You always want your buyer to have the out. Now here's where it gets tricky. You have a fiduciary obligation to your buyer. And the agreement is calling for a removal of contingency. Hear me close. The agreement is calling for a removal of contingency. And you have a fiduciary to your buyer. You must tell your buyer and make sure that they are fully aware it is time to remove that contingency. It is up to them of whether or not they want to ride in the danger zone or whether they want to go ahead and remove it. You don't make that decision for them. You don't put them in the danger zone because you're feeling risky today. Right? You put them in the danger zone because they decided to be there.
So as the buyer's agent, are you waiting for the seller to send you the removal?
As the buyer's agent, are you waiting for the seller to send it to you? No, the agreement calls for a removal of contingency. Now, does that mean, and as your fiduciary obligation to your buyer, you've got to make sure that your buyer fully comprehends that he is now responsible to remove that contingency. He can make the choice to not remove it at that time, but you're not making the decision for him, the buyer's making the decision. Your obligation is to tell them what is to be done, right? And the buyer can come back and say, I want to wait this out. Let's see if they say anything. Okay, he's putting himself in the hot seat. And then really, truly, what's the worst thing that can happen? What can the seller do if you don't remove the contingency and now we're on day 23? What's the worst thing that can happen on day 23 at this point?
He could cancel the transaction.
The seller can send a notice of buyer to perform at this point, right? You can't cancel anything yet. You put them on notice. Well, I mean, they could send a cancellation, right? He could if he wanted to, right? The protocol would be to send a notice of performance to the buyer. Hey, you said in the agreement you were going to remove this in 10 days. You haven't done it. I'm putting you on notice. You have 24 hours to remove the contingency, or else I, as the seller, have the right to what? To cancel. Does that mean the seller has to cancel? No. It means that the seller now has the right to cancel the agreement. Are you with me? Do you have a 2 o'clock class?
All true, do I know?
Okay.
I just popped in to say hi.
Hi, Scott. This is our broker, by the way, Scott Cooper.
Yay!
I really am alive, I do exist. You know,
And it does make an appearance every now and then.
every now and again. I was on a call with CAR today,
Uh-huh.
risk management,
Okay.
and I don't want to scare you guys, okay, but I want you guys to understand how serious this is right now. CAR is predicting that we are going to have, and it won't affect any of you guys.
Can't hear.
Oh.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No. Here.
Broker appearance.
Actually, here. This doesn't work, so just use that.
Didn't realize we were on Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I was telling, did you guys hear the story I was starting?
Nope.
Okay, so what I was saying was, I was in a meeting with CAR about risk management all morning this morning. And their biggest concern right now is in the next 2 to 3 years, brokers and agents are going to be hit with good faith lawsuits. Have you guys ever heard of a good faith lawsuit? Neither have we. Okay? But it's what they're expecting. And the things that are going to pull them on is exactly this. I didn't remove my contingency because I wanted to save my buyer's deposit. All right? That's not acting in good faith. I wrote offers on 19 homes at the same time, but only wanted to buy one. That's not acting in good faith. I waited 9 days to present your offer because I wanted to wait until we hit 50 before I presented them to the seller. That's not acting in good faith. Okay, and this is a big concern with CAR right now, and we're trying to get ahead of it and figure out what we can do to stop it. Writing offers without contingencies in them. All right, it's the nature of the business right now. It's what's happening. But let's step forward 3 months, and the guy that just paid $100,000 above appraised value for his house gets transferred back east to a place in Florida. Is his relocation company going to pay him back that $100,000? Probably not. All right, so once again, not acting in good faith. You got to be careful. Like Drew was saying, it is the seller and buyer's decision All we are messengers. That's all we are. We're very well-paid messengers, but that's all we are. We give them the information, we explain it 100%, and we let them make the decisions, all right? So just something that happened today, and front desk is sending an email out with all the different quick guides that CAR offers to help you guys out. So take some time and take a look at that, all right? And,
Awesome.
And thanks, Drew.
Yeah.
Sorry to interfere.
No, great. Thank you,
Thank you
Scott.
for
I
that
appreciate
info.
that.
Really good timing.
Yeah, it was good timing. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
Just in time.
Yes. I love going over contingencies and fiduciary responsibilities. I love that.
When I'm fighting transactions for you guys,
Yep,
this is where I'm fighting.
that's right there. He says when he's fighting transactions for us, this is where he's fighting. And it's true, because most agents, 99% of the agents that you guys are doing business with do not know their contract. And they do not know this piece. And I swore when I started here almost 3 years ago, I was going to change that, at least from a KW standpoint. By golly, our people are going to know this. So this is why I go. Scott does it too. He teaches the contract weekly, I believe, right? Every Tuesday and Thursday, twice a week. So you can jump on one of his calls. But I still put this into our coaching skills workshop from time to time because I think it's so vital that our people know this thing like the back of their hand. And you got to really separate it. You remember how we've talked several times about the waffle brain versus the spaghetti brain? Think about a plate of spaghetti. What's going on in a plate of spaghetti? It's all intertwined, right? What's going on with a waffle? When you go to IHOP, you hop, we all hop for IHOP. What happens? When you sit down and they put the waffle in front of you and you start to put the butter and the butter goes into one square but it doesn't go to the other square, and then you put the syrup on top, right? It's all compartmentalized. This contract needs to be compartmentalized. You cannot approach this with a spaghetti brain, right, where you're intertwining everything. You got to remember, just like we've been talking about the whole time, your fiduciary obligation to the client is separate from what the agreement is calling for them to do. Right? If you intertwined that, you might think, oh, I'm doing what's best for them. I won't remove the contingency and I'll wait and I won't even tell them about it. That's the way that a spaghetti brain would approach that. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate you. Whereas a waffle brain would be way more about, no, it is my obligation to make sure that the buyer is informed and they know the risks, and then they make the decision. Right? If I'm working for the seller, I need to make sure that my seller knows what I'm doing, the action I'm taking. I'm giving them a notice of buyer to perform. So what does that mean? It means that I'm about to take some action on your behalf, and here are the likely consequences of that action. And this is what it could mean for us. We could tick them off and they could just send us a cancellation. Right? In this market, you're not seeing that. But by the way, you can't do your business by this market. Right? Lots of conversation. I don't know how many of you get up at dark 30 in the morning to watch Squawk Box or Fox News Business to watch the stock market. But the word on the street is that real estate agents are going to be on the decline as the market begins to move in the other direction. We always see a peak in real estate agents in a market like we have because truthfully, anybody can step in and sell something right now. If I were to put a for sale by owner sign in my front yard today, I would have 10 offers before I put my head on the pillow tonight. Right? It took nothing. It took no action. In fact, the RV business is no different, and I've decided that I think I've decided that I'm going to get a new RV, a bigger, better RV. And so I've been told if you put yours on the market, Drew, you're going to sell it. Sure enough. Matter of fact, I have so many inquiries and offers right now, I've decided maybe I don't want to sell it. maybe now it's too real, right? Like it doesn't, I didn't do anything. I took 4 pictures and I put it on RV Trader. I didn't even do what I would normally do. Have it waxed, make sure my wife decorated the interior of it, right? Selling an RV is like selling a house. right? And I would be doing all this stuff, and I would take 50 pictures and do a video of it and put the floor plan from the manufacturer's website, right? I would put some attention into it, but I put nothing in. And I can sell it today if I want, for more than I paid for it, mind you. So same thing with the house business. Anybody can do it. Why am I telling you that? Don't pat yourself on the back if you're new. That means we have work to do. We have to know and understand how this business works from every angle in every market. And we will be sorting out those who are willing to roll up their sleeves and learn, and those who are willing to ride in the roller coaster Goliath and be on the roller coaster. And those who are on the roller coaster will be probably getting off. And those of us who didn't get on will still be here. How we behave here is how we behave anywhere.
And so also, again, the reality of this is that because we are the leader, leading the transaction, I've never had a problem where, I've never had a client say, I don't want to remove. I say, it's time for us to remove. We had our inspection, it's 17 days, we had our inspection, there's no repairs or whatever, it's time for us to say.
Right.
They're like, okay, go ahead and just send it to me. Okay, it's in your inbox.
Right. So what Isabel's saying is, as the leader, we are to direct and lead the transaction, right? So what she's saying is she's had buyers say, I don't want to do it. And then she explains further. Well, here's the ramifications if you don't. Here's what could happen. And then, oh, okay, well, go ahead and send it to me then, right? Now, if after you explain it and they still don't want, okay. But again, as the leader, most people are going to follow your lead. And if you misdirect them and misguide them, that won't be good. All you're going to do, like Scott had said, I don't like the word messenger per se, because you are relaying the information, so it's a little bit deeper than a messenger, but you're interpreting what they agreed to. They signed this document and probably didn't read it. So you're making sure they have understanding of what they signed and that they adhere to what they signed. And as long as you're doing that, you're good, right? Did you guys have a comment?
Oh, I was just asking, where do I, just go get a copy of these forms, if they look hard?
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, it's 11 minutes after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We're supposed to be done at 2, so oopsie, my bad. Any other questions, comments, concerns? I could go on for another 2 hours, another day.
I know, and that would be really nice to also, but what about, we haven't gone to the disclosure, so is this gonna be carried over to another day?
So we'll have to carry on for disclosures. Yeah, apparently it takes longer to talk about contingencies than, well, and I have stories in between too.
Yeah, and they're good stories, 'cause,
So, all right, guys. Let's see. I have something in the chat. Wenda, send out the contingency once at 21 days, or send out 2. Good question, Beth. So you can send out as many contingencies as you want or need. So you can send out 1 at inspection, 1 at appraisal, 1 at loan removal. You can do that. Or you can send out 1 that covers everything. Or you can send out 1 that removes everything except appraisal. And then send a second one when you remove the appraisal. You can do any of that. And I would suggest that there is no rule of thumb on this, that it's up to you, your client, and the individual circumstance that you find yourself in.
and you can also remove on the same one form for buyer
One
and
form.
seller.
On one form, you can remove all of the contingencies. But that brings up a really interesting point. I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you said that. Can I keep you for just a moment longer?
Sure.
I want to show you what she's talking about. What Lizzie just said is that you can on one form you can remove both buyer and seller contingencies. So I want to make sure that we're clear on this. Oops, wrong document. Because there's misunderstanding around this. And I see it all the time. All of the time. So you click on, number one, if this were number one, if it were number two, if it were number three, whatever number that it was, right? And what document that it's going to be attached to, right? And all the information. And see here, you can check off individual boxes, or you can say all of them except the loan contingency if you want. Or you can click down here where it says all of them. We go ahead and just everything, we remove it all, okay? And the buyer's going to sign this. Now here's what's important to note. The seller does not sign this document unless the seller has a disclosure to, a contingency to remove. Did you hear me?
Yes, like selling,
I cannot, yes.
yeah.
So like if seller said, we'll go ahead and sell you our home contingent on us finding a new home.
Right.
Okay? So this is where the seller could remove that contingency. Okay? And then in that case, the buyer would not sign this. The seller would.
Okay, so
Here's what the confirmation of receipt down here at the bottom. This is where the respective other party would initial and put a date acknowledging receipt of the document. So in a normal, typical, everyday, 80% of our transactions over the years, and now it's higher than that, as the buyer's agent, I'm going to click on, they're going to remove all contingencies. My buyer is going to sign and date this, and I send this over to the listing agent. And the listing agent will have her seller initial, and she'll check seller, and they'll initial it and date it right here. And what they're saying is, I hear you. You removed your contingency. I hear you. You're good. Awesome. Thank you. If they sign this, the document is not complete. This says, seller remove. There's this awesome thing. Was it invented? I don't know if it's an invention. There's this awesome thing, and we've been doing this for hundreds of years. You may have heard of it. It's what we do is we start on the left-hand side of a page, and we group letters together to form words, and then we group words together to form sentences, and then sentences together that form paragraphs that form thoughts. And then what we do is we take them from left to right and we read them, and then we know what's going on and we have clarity in the situation. So how do I know when my agents, when my peeps have not used this aged-old tradition that we call reading? How will that be known to me? There's a seller's signature underneath the buyer's signature on this form. Because it says on the very first line, by the way, it's not even hidden in the fine print. It's on the very first line, and it's in bold letters, and it says, seller removal of seller contingencies. When you have your seller signing this document, what contingencies exactly are they removing? Perhaps.
So what if you're double ending it? And then you want to remove your buyers, and then you want to remove your sellers? If you do that on the same form,
I think that you would be confusing to do so.
because down at the bottom, there's only one signature that can authorize receipt.
Correct.
So that's why we cannot do that.
I would say that would be confusing. I think one probably could do it if you were, creative, but then it would cause confusion, and anytime we have confusion, we end up with a lawsuit.
So it's just best to do.
Right, so just do two, right? And by the way, they would be contingency removal number 1 and contingency removal number 1 for the seller. Wouldn't it? How could it be number 2? Then wouldn't I be wondering where the removal number 1 was for the seller? Wouldn't I be, where's number 1? There is no number 1. Well, why is it marked number 2 then? Wouldn't that draw confusion? Contingency number, rule number one for the buyer, contingency number, same thing with your counteroffers, right? Buyer counteroffer number one, seller counteroffer number one. Yes, it is the second counteroffer being generated, but it is the first seller counteroffer. Are you with me? So the seller only signs this down here when the seller has a contingency to remove. Otherwise, they're initialing here confirming receipt of the buyer's contingency.
And then the buyer would initial, right?
And then the buyer would initial.
Would
And you would
initial-
check this box here instead.
Right, and then he would sign, or they would,
And the seller would sign this, and the buyer would not sign here. Because up here it says buyer removal of buyer contingencies. In this case, that would not apply. Are you with me?
well, kind of, sort of, I'm so sorry, you guys. I just really need to get this straight. Okay, so down at the bottom, okay, where, seller, signs this, okay, because we're removing the seller contingency.
Okay.
Okay, so now buyer is going to
Initial.
initial, but does buyer
Excellent.
sign?
Buyer does not sign because buyer, right up here, buyer removal of buyer contingencies. Who's removing the contingency on this form?
So buyer would only initial.
The seller is removing the contingency. So the buyer doesn't sign it. The seller signs it. Right here. Closing on replacement property. Seller signs. Buyer initials. Confirmation on this date. Perfect. Done. Thank you, seller, for removing your contingency. Now,
Buyer's agreeing.
now new form. New form. Now the buyer is removing all of their contingencies. And now I change this to the seller. And the seller does not sign. The seller initials confirmation of receipt. You still don't get it?
I'm still confused. Okay, so going back to the buyer, check, no, down at the bottom.
Right here. Buyer removes all contingencies. Boom, they sign. I agree to remove all of my contingencies.
I'm talking in regards to the seller.
Right, we already talked about that, right?
I know,
So,
I'm still confused.
so the seller is going to remove their contingency, closing a replacement property. They're going to sign this. I, Alec, and I, Kathleen, remove my contingency for closing on a replacement property. Then they're going to send it over, and the buyer is now going to initial this, saying, I confirm receipt that you're removing your contingency. The buyer is not removing a contingency here. See? This says buyer removal. If the buyer signs this, it means nothing.
They just confirm the agreement to it, right?
What?
They just confirm the agreement to that, okay, that's fine.
They're confirming. I got it.
I got it, okay, yeah.
I got receipt of your contingency removal. Otherwise, how would you ever prove that it was done? You wouldn't be able to prove it, right? Now, new contingency removal. And now we're going to represent the buyer. It says buyer removal of contingencies. Now we're going to click on buyer removes all the contingencies. And the seller is not going to sign anything because they're not removing anything. And now we're going to come down here and we're going to check the seller box. And the seller is going to initial and date that they received a copy of the contingency removal from the buyer. The person signing the document is the person who is removing the contingency. The person who is initialing at the bottom is accepting receipt of said removal. Does that make sense?
Yep. got
Okay,
it. Thank you.
perfect. You're welcome. All right, ladies and gentle cars,
Okay,
it's been fun.
Absolutely.
It's been real.
I gotta go get some contingency.
And it's been real fun.
all right,
But it ain't been
nice.
Thank you.
See y'all soon.